October 3rd to 4th, 1993. What do you do when the night fills with screaming engines, falling metal, and the sound of men dying in the dark streets below? When a Black Hawk spirals out of the sky and slams into Mogadishu like a death sentence, and you are a medic holding bandages instead of answers, knowing that every step forward may mean your own end, but every step back means leaving brothers to bleed alone in a city that wants you dead? This was the brutal moral maze faced by U.S. forces during the Battle of Mogadishu, a mission that began as a daylight raid to capture lieutenants of Mohammed Farah, ID'd and collapsed into one of the most harrowing urban battles in modern military history, where medics found themselves under constant fire, performing life-saving procedures in alleys soaked with blood, surrounded by the smell of burning wreckage, cordite, and fear, while Somali militia fighters and armed civilians closed in from every direction, firing RPGs and AK-47s from rooftops, doorways, even behind women and children, turning the city itself into a living weapon. When Super 6-1 was hit and crashed, followed later by Super 6-4 deeper inside hostile territory, the question tore through command channels and individual consciences alike. Do we push further into hell to save the fallen, or do we pull back and risk abandoning our own? And for the medics on the ground, this was not theory or policy, but a ticking clock measured in arterial spray and fading pulses. As combat lifesavers crawled through gunfire to reach wounded rangers and Delta operators, applying tourniquets with shaking hands, sealing sucking chest wounds while bullets snapped inches overhead, hearing the screams of men calling for their mothers and for God, and sometimes going silent forever. Specialist medic stories from that night describe kneeling in the open street, illuminated by fires from the crash site, trying to intubate a wounded soldier while militia fighters dragged bodies away and hacked at them with machetes. The horror so raw that even seasoned operators felt their resolve fracture. Yet still they stayed, because leaving was not an option they could live with. Inside the second crash site, pilots Michael Durant and others fought hand-to-hand until ammunition ran low, while outside, medics attempted to stabilize casualties knowing extraction was nearly impossible. Radio calls overlapping with screams and gunfire. Commanders forced to make decisions with incomplete information as night fell and visibility vanished. Weighing the risk of sending more convoys into narrow streets where RPG ambushes waited against the certainty that wounded men would die without help. One medic recalled holding pressure on a femoral bleed for nearly an hour, his gloves slick with blood, his arms burning, whispering to the wounded ranger to stay awake while tracer rounds cut the darkness like red knives. Another remembered stepping over bodies they could not stop for, haunted by the knowledge that triage meant choosing who might live and who would almost certainly die. The horror deepened as Somali crowds overwhelmed crash sites, mutilating bodies in scenes later broadcast worldwide. Images that burned into the minds of those who survived and reshaped American military policy for years. Yet even in that chaos, acts of staggering heroism emerged. Medics running out of supplies and tearing fabric from their own uniforms. Soldiers forming human shields so treatment could continue. Pilots volunteering to insert themselves into the second crash, knowing rescue was unlikely. Choices made not because orders demanded them, but because conscience did. The moral dilemma was constant and merciless. Every rescue attempt risked more Black Hawks, more convoys destroyed, more medics forced to choose between two dying men. And yet to retreat entirely would mean surrendering the wounded to a fate worse than death. So the fight dragged on through the night into the early hours of October 4th, until a battered relief column of U.S. and Allied forces finally broke through, evacuating survivors in what became known as the Mogadishu Mile. Soldiers limping, carrying their wounded, exhausted beyond language. The cost was 19 Americans killed, dozens wounded, and hundreds of Somalis dead. But numbers cannot capture the psychological scars left on those medics. who still remember the weight of a dying man's head in their lap, the sound of RPGs detonating close enough to feel the heat, the smell of blood mixed with dust and smoke, and the knowledge that survival often came down to seconds and impossible choices. This was not a clean war or a simple mission. It was a night where courage and horror lived side by side, where classified objectives dissolved into raw human survival, and where the question of retreat versus resistance was answered again and again by individuals who chose to move toward the wounded, despite overwhelming odds. Yet even now, decades later, the shadow of Mogadishu lingers, forcing us to ask one final chilling question. When duty demands everything and the cost is almost certainly death, would you still step into the fire to save one life? Or would you turn away and live with the silence that follows?